until 1 p.m. Monday, January 27th, and that this order also constitute the adjournment of the Senate.
Without objection, so ordered. The Senate is adjourned.
All right. This is short and sweet, about an hour less than the time the Republicans were supposedly going to be granted to state their case, but truncating it all down to a couple of key points when it came to aid that might or might not have been held to Ukraine, that this was a common tactic and something the president has the right to do, did so when it came to countries like South Korea. Left out in that argument, though, was why in this particular case it was withheld, but that was not their point, only to say that the president has the power to do this, has routinely done it, as have some of his predecessors. Also about the president's skepticism to do anything based on findings of the intelligence community. After the Mueller report, Jay Sekulow had mentioned again and again that the president had reason to doubt some of the so-called evidence or findings of those in the intelligence community and not necessarily heed their advice. The defense also argued that Ambassador Sondland had only assumed a quid pro quo and kept playing tapes to that extent, that he thought there might be a quid pro quo, but he had no proof of that. They wanted to hammer that point again and again, as if to say that going after material on Joe Biden or Hunter Biden was tantamount to withholding aid until they got just that. Much was made of this, the Democrats' push to say these were impeachable offenses, but these were common, everyday executive rights and privileges that the President of the United States has. And to put them in that context, Chad Pergram on the Capitol right now on these developments, that, Chad, this ended up being about an hour shorter than the time that they were originally granted to discuss this. I suspect that this will be the rule now, and they will not eat up all 24 hours they're allotted. What do you think?
Well, that's part of the contrast that the president's defense team is trying to mount when they go up against the House Democratic impeachment managers, that they don't need to be as exhaustive. And the White House counsel, Pat Cipollone, indicated at the beginning of his remarks this was a little bit of a jab at the Democratic managers. He said to the senators, quote, "We're going to be respectful of your time." And so they get out about an hour early. I will say this, one of the main things they talked about is refuting the Democrats' case. Also, the fact that they have last change here. They can go back and say, okay, you heard them for 24 hours. Let's go back and assess what they say. This is something from Mike Purpura, the deputy White House counsel. He says there is no evidence that President Trump ever linked security assistance to any investigations. And he also went to undercut the chain of custody about what some of the Democratic witnesses who they brought in during the hearings in November and December actually knew about this alleged issue about how the Ukraine aid was held up. And Purpura said the following: most Democratic witnesses have never spoken to the president at all, let alone about Ukraine security assistance here. The other thing I was struck by, and this came in the opening remarks of the trial, Barry Black, the Senate chaplain, he usually says something very pointed, and this caught my ear as soon as they gavelled in the Senate trial. He said, quote, in the prayer, "We trust the power of your prevailing providence to bring this important trial to the conclusion you desire." Now, what this sets up is on Monday and Tuesday, the defense will continue their arguments, maybe going a little bit deeper. When we saw them show video clips, I was struck by the fact that they showed Republican members of the House posing questions to the witnesses compared to the Democratic clips over the past 3 days where they were having Democratic members pose the questions to the witnesses there. And then they get to the issue of questions. These are written questions that the senators will direct through the Chief Justice, and then maybe late next week, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, the issue of witnesses. Front and center is the question about the Bidens. When I spoke with Angus King, an independent senator from Maine yesterday, a lot of Republicans think that the Democrats opened the door, the Democratic House managers, to the Bidens because they talked about them so many times, citing them 226 times in the presentation on Thursday. And he said, calling Hunter Biden is about like calling him to be a witness in the O.J. trial. That was the quote from Senator King. He says it comes down to relevance. So if they ever get to a vote on witnesses, one wonders if this will be a question that the Chief Justice will have to resolve. Obviously, they'll have to vote. When you talk to senators here, Neil, they talk about that vote maybe being right on the razor's edge. Lindsey Graham, the Republican senator from South Carolina, the chair of the Judiciary Committee, indicated that he would not be for calling the Bidens. He would like to maybe investigate the Bidens outside of the scope of this trial. If they vote for witnesses, it's Ali Offenfree. We have no idea how long this trial could go, but if they keep it pretty narrow, work through the questions the middle of next week, and then vote for no witnesses, and again, it could be a vote that just says, I want this witness, and it gets voted down or up, or I want this witness, it gets voted down or up. It's not like you're saying, okay, we're voting for witnesses at large. There's a couple of different ways you could create that vote. This could be wrapped up by the end of next week. And again, it's possible that you might not have a vote actually on both articles of impeachment, but it could be in play where you have a motion to dismiss. The problem, though, even though there are some Republican senators who might like to do that, is that that does not fully exonerate the president. And one wonders if the White House, and one wonders if the president, and one wonders if maybe some Republican senators might say, okay, we might have the votes to dismiss, not saying that they're there now. Rand Paul, the Republican senator from Kentucky, indicated that he thought there were about 45 there. But they might say, let's actually go to vote on the charges here, because obviously you need 67 to convict and remove, and they're nowhere near that right now. Again, one final point here. What's still resonating in the Capitol were the remarks last night from Adam Schiff, kind of the closing argument here. And Kevin Cramer, who is a Republican senator from North Dakota, he said the following about Schiff's closing remarks. He said that Adam Schiff's best 2 hours were when he opened on Wednesday. He said that was the best 2 hours that Adam Schiff put forward. He said his worst 10 minutes were the last 10. He left a bad mark going out the door. And what we have seen here is that it does not appear as though any of the remarks by the Democratic managers have swayed any Republican senators. Nobody even kind of toggling on the fence, Neil.
Chad, on that point real quickly, if you don't mind, it seems to be a strategy on the part of the president's legal team to get some of those Republican senators who might be contemplating witnesses, off that fear that if they don't look like they're doing their job. It's as if they're laying out a groundwork by never focusing on the Bidens at all in this response to say, you have plenty of room here not to even consider witnesses, because the legal arguments that have been presented by the other side have been tilted and left out key testimony that they didn't bring up.
Right, and that's something that we heard from the White House defense team today, where they took a tack similar to the Republicans in the House of Representatives, criticizing the process, even parroting some of the similar language we heard from the likes of Jim Jordan, the Republican congressman from Ohio, saying, well, these meetings were down in the bunker, there wasn't due process. That's something, obviously, the Democrats contend. Richard Blumenthal, a Democratic senator from Connecticut, indicated that if they don't vote for witnesses, he could see where basically, Democrats are weaponizing those roll call votes against those Republican senators to say, if you're not voting for witnesses and additional documents, then you're part of a cover-up. And this is where Senator Blumenthal says that's something that some Republicans will have to, answer for in November, looking at those swing state Republicans who face competitive re-election bids this fall. Joni Ernst in Iowa, Martha McSally in Arizona, Tom Tillis in North Carolina, Susan Collins in Maine, just to name a few. Those votes are going to be, crystallized into the campaign. And one other point I want to make that is just paramount. Usually in an election year, we look at the debates, maybe the conventions, we look at Iowa and New Hampshire as being the pivotal events in an election year. They aren't the pivotal events this year. It's this Senate trial. And what comes out of this Senate trial, what's said, what the roll call votes are, that will play in every House race, every Senate race, and also in the presidential contest, Neil.
All right, Chet Burgum, thank you very, very much. Senators have been filing out, to just sort of move on with their day. They got about an hour early start on that. But Maryland Democratic Senator Ben Cardin was kind enough to take some time to chat with us. Senator, what did you think?
Well, Neil, it's good to be with you. We're now hearing from the president's attorneys. They're disputing some of the facts. And I thought a point that was raised today was very important, the importance of cross-examination as they were talking about the president's due process. It's important that we hear from the House managers. It's important that we hear from the president's attorneys. But I think it's most important that we hear from those witnesses that have the direct information so that we can hear from them directly. We're conducting a trial. You need to hear from the witnesses themselves if you're going to have a fair trial.
Are you worried, Senator, that the way certain testimony was presented by Congressman Schiff, it left out some very crucial details, like Ambassador Sondland and this notion of quid pro quo, that he assumed that was the case, but when pressed on that, couldn't say so unequivocally. Had nothing to back that up outside of the gut feeling. I believe that's how he termed it at the time, an assumption, and that wasn't a fair presentation. It was tilted on the part of Mr. Schiff.
Well, I can assure you I'm taking very good notes of everything that's being said, and I expect that the House managers are trying to present the strongest case that they can. I expect the president's lawyers will be presenting the strongest case that they can. I want to get to as much source information as possible. So that's why I say documents and witnesses to me are key. And again, the point that was raised by the president's lawyer, that the ability to hear and cross-examine witnesses is critical to finding out the truth. And I would just hope that we would have a chance to talk to the witnesses, particularly those that did not testify in the House.
Do you find the way that the Trump defense team tried to frame the president's support for and backing of Ukraine, not only because of his long-term defense commitments, but contrasting that with President Obama, as if to say, you might argue quid pro quo, but this is a president who in the end gave the Ukrainians the aid that they needed and had a history of being very vigilant in that regard, and that when it comes to holding off aid, which of course is a presidential right, he's done it with other countries. South Korea comes to mind. What did you think of that?
Well, Neil, that's probably the central factual issue in this impeachment trial. I'm going to withhold full judgment until I've heard from all the evidence I can get. But I'll tell you this, the support for Ukraine by the United States is critically important to our national interests. Democrats and Republicans have supported it. This administration has provided lethal aid to Ukraine. That's very important. The Obama administration provided, when the invasion took place, the immediate response to the United States to impose sanctions. Our actions, our country's actions, both Democrats and Republicans, has been to support Ukraine because we know how important it is to our national security. How it relates to this impeachment trial deals with whether it was used for inappropriate partisan political purposes, and that's a central factual issue that I'll wait for judgment until all the evidence is presented.
Senator, it's more of a funny type question, but how do you go through this process? You guys apparently can have milk, water, candy, and that's about it. What do you do?
I tell you, it's tough on your body. I mean that sincerely. It's unusual. Senators to stay quiet for several days on end. It's a challenge. And to be separated from our electronic devices, I think some senators would need to take some medication to keep themselves calm without their iPhones. So it is a challenge. There's no question about it. But I tell you, I keep myself busy because I really am trying to get as much of the factual information. This is a very serious issue, the most serious issue in impeachment, and I hope we take it very seriously.
I'd still eat the candy, Senator, but thank you very much, sir. Have a good weekend. Now to Mark Meredith of the White House. Do we know, Mark, whether the president was watching any of this, taking it in?
Neil, he was tweeting about it. In fact, he tweeted out a link where people could watch it. So it's interesting. The president certainly was teeing up what was going to be happening there in the Senate chambers. But we expected this to be a shorter session today, and that's exactly what we got. The sources close to the legal team had told us they expected this to go on for about 2 to 3 hours. And as we just were seeing, it went out a little more than 2 hours today. The White House was also making it very clear that they feel that impeachment has been all about politics, not necessarily about facts. And I thought it was interesting that the White House counsel, Pat Cipollone, he started right out the gate saying that they believe that this is a case for Democrats to overturn the 2016 election and really hinder the president going into 2020. They felt that the president has simply been under siege ever since he came into office back in 2017. And we even saw some of the president's lawyers bring up the Mueller report and the constant questioning that the White House feels that they think has really been unnecessary. It was also interesting as the president's lawyers went through the transcript of the president's call with President Zelensky of Ukraine back in last summer, that the president's lawyers argued that House Democratic case managers have been kind of omitting key points and that they feel like they've been trying to read between the lines as opposed to going through the facts of that transcript. But of course, this is exactly what we expected the president's legal defense team to do because there has been so much buildup into what we saw today. But what's very interesting, Neil, as we've been talking about, was that really this was a preview of what we expect to hear a lot more about on Monday. holiday. And why is that? Well, the president tweeted yesterday afternoon that he felt that Saturday was simply Death Valley in television, that fewer people would be watching, and that this would not be the best chance for the president to present his defense, for his team to present his defense. So the president seemed a little perturbed that this was going to be happening on a Saturday, and maybe that's why we saw that shorter session of just about 2 hours or so. The White House was also arguing that they felt that House Democrats have not been really playing fair with the proceedings that have been taking place on the House side the last couple of months. Now, whether or not that's really going to have any impact on what the senators will decide, of course, is still yet to be seen, because the White House has, of course, refused to send over some documents to the House. They've blocked testimony from certain White House officials. And Neil, as you can imagine, that has certainly led to this other charge that we've seen, obstruction of Congress. As for the president, though, we have not seen him on camera today. It's kind of a cold, and it was raining earlier day here in Washington. We don't expect him to leave the White House, so we don't expect him to be heading out to the golf course or making any other comments on camera. But we'll be watching to see on Twitter, Neil, if he has any response to what we saw from his lawyers earlier today. Neil?
I was a little surprised by the take that Saturday ratings are Death Valley in TV. I mean,
we're always working.
Right,
yeah, exactly.
This show gets higher ratings than my daily FNC show. Having said that, there might be a strategy to that. But there also seems to be, and I'm curious what you think, Margaret, what you've heard, that no matter how you slice it and what we're in store for next week, that the Republicans are not going to take up those 24 hours. They have 22 hours they could obviously use, but they're not going to do that, and they feel they don't have to do that. What do you think of that?
Well, I also think it's interesting, Neil, is that the White House has really been saying we're going to focus on things other than impeachment. You know, the president, he's going to be hitting the road next week. He's got campaign rallies in New Jersey, one in Iowa. He's going to be, there's still talk about the USMCA signing here at the White House next week. So it's interesting. While all of this has been playing out on the Hill, you've seen the White House really trying to counter-program a little bit, focusing on the business of the nation at hand. We saw the president continue with his trip last week to Davos for the economic summit, which is interesting because that came on the first day as the Senate was beginning their impeachment proceedings. So we've certainly seen that as the White House is ready to say there's a lot more going on behind the scenes than just with what's happening with impeachment. But you're right, Neil. We did not expect that the president's defense team to take up their entire allotted time. And we've also heard, of course, that they felt that a lot of the arguments that Democrats made in those first 3 days were repetitive, that things could have been shortened up because it followed what we heard from the Democratic case managers back on the House side. But of course, Democrats argue that the stakes here are so high that they have to make this case. They have to make this so clear cut that there really is no room for error, and that they wanted to make sure that everybody understood what was at stake here. As I mentioned, though, Neil, right now, nothing on the president's schedule for the weekend, so we don't expect to see him at least today. Neil?
All right, great job as always, my friend Mark Meredith at the White House. We'll get any news from there, of course, we'll pass it along to you. Florida Republican Senator Rick Scott with us right now. Senator, what did you think?
I think Adam Schiff got kneecapped. I think the White House counsel showed that there was no due process in the House. It was a complete, just fabrication what he did. And then what they did was they explained that there was no quid pro quo, there was no obstruction of justice. So I think he did a great job. Neil, I think I've come to the conclusion why Nancy Pelosi held the articles of impeachment for 33 days. This whole thing is to help Joe Biden. I mean, all this is to keep Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren off the campaign trail and help Joe Biden. I think this is no different what happened to Sanders back in 2016. So I'm looking forward to hearing more from the White House counsel on Monday and Tuesday and getting our questions in and finally making a decision.
You know, it is interesting, too, Senator, about whether part of the strategy, the legal strategy, I'm not a lawyer, I'm just passing along some insights others have passed to me, that this might be a way of sort of laying out a groundwork and a case for senators in your party who are open to the idea of witnesses, that there's no need for that right now, that enough doubts have been raised about the Democratic presentation that you don't have to. What do you think?
Well, Neil, this is the House's job. I mean, they're the ones who came in here and said there was overwhelming evidence. Oh, this is a clear-cut case. They're the ones who rushed this through, didn't subpoena John Bolton. I mean, they keep saying they want to hear from John Bolton. Why didn't they subpoena him? I mean, why didn't they go through this process? Because they were rushed, because this is a partisan deal to what changed the election in 2016, and I mean, tried to kick Donald Trump off the ballot in 2020. I mean, let the voters decide this stuff. So this has just been a partisan hack job against the president.
But do you think, Senator, that there might be an opportunity for Republicans who are a little ticked off about how the House handled it to talk to some of these people, to flesh out, even an Ambassador Sondland, to say, all right, we saw again and again your comments about the perception that there was a quid pro quo, didn't see as much, the tape that was also available, that you were making a gut call. In other words, that some of your colleagues might be intrigued to have witnesses to clarify that.
Yeah. They might. I mean, look, we're going to have a fair process. I think what Mitch McConnell proposed is it was a fair process. I'm shocked that the Democrats didn't go along with it because it's what we did in the Clinton case. But I think we're going to have a fair process. I don't know if we'll have witnesses or not. I think the process we're going through, where we listen to the White House counsel now and you get to ask questions, is a good process. It's based on what I heard this morning. I think it's pretty convincing that this was just a rush job to try to get this president. And I think Nancy Pelosi is trying to help Joe Biden here.
We'll see, because those 4 Democratic senators who are running for president now will be able to hop on the next flight to Iowa. We'll see what they do to take advantage of these 48 hours they have. Senator, thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Dill. Have a good day.
All right. Just reminding you that all the senators have to be there throughout this entire trial. This one ending early today, as it has, allows them, of course, we're talking prominently about Senator Sanders, Senator Warren, Senator Klobuchar, Senator Bennett, who now could go to Iowa if they so choose, and see if they can move the needle a little bit, about a week ahead of the Iowa caucuses. With us right now is the former Assistant U.S. Attorney Andrew McCarthy. Andrew, always good having you. I think a lot comes down, and you're the expert here, I obviously defer to you, to another strategy to help those senators who are in a box and should I or shouldn't I on witnesses, to take the onus off them by presenting a legal argument. We don't need witnesses. We don't need to go to that next step. What do you think?
Well, I do think that ought to be a goal, Neil, but what I'm baffled about in connection with the strategy, and I should preface this by saying I think they did a fine job of poking some holes in the Democrats' factual presentation, but if your goal here is to not extend this with witnesses and documents, I don't know that I would have come flying out of the box engaging on quid pro quo. I should say that, my assessment of the case, for what it's worth, is that I'm willing to accept, at least for argument's sake, that the president was squeezing the Ukrainians to have investigations that I don't think anybody should be offended by. That certainly looks objectively like there's something worth investigating in connection with the Bidens. Ukraine's role in the 2016 election is something that it's perfectly reasonable to look into.
But, Andrew, there was another distinction that the legal representation made here, that he has every right to do that. They're arguing he has every right to do that. And we might argue over whether this was the means by which he could, but that this president had, and other presidents before him had, addressed aid or readdressed aid with certain countries for a variety of reasons. Now, how do you think that impacted senators sitting in that room?
Well, what I'm saying is that I would accept as a given that happened, and say that it's absurd to think that we would impeach a president under circumstances where, as the president's lawyers pointed out today, the Ukrainians virtually didn't know there was any hold on the aid. They got the aid. There was no compromise at all to Ukraine's security. They didn't have to promise any investigations. And even Zelensky got his visit ultimately with the president, even though it wasn't in the Oval Office. It was at a very high-profile meeting in New York. So to me, this is an opportunity to point out, bottom line here, these articles of impeachment are woefully insufficient to remove a president of the United States, particularly just a few months before the election. And then I think I would have been trying to hit some of the premises of the Democrats' case, which I don't think anybody's looked at. For example, it's just ridiculous to think that an investigation by the Ukrainians of Joe Biden would have any effect on the American election. Who would
we
care
will see,
about
Andrew.
it?
I don't mean to jump on you. Chuck Schumer is responding to these developments today. Let's listen in on that.
They made a really compelling case for why the Senate should call witnesses and documents. They kept saying there are no eyewitness accounts, but there are people who have eyewitness accounts. The very 4 witnesses and the very 4 sets of documents that we have asked for. They made the argument that no one really knows what the president intended. It's speculation what the president intended when he cut off aid. But there are people who do know. Mick Mulvaney knows. In all likelihood, Mr. Blair knows. Mr. Bolton may know. Why shouldn't we have witnesses and documents here? I thought, and one other point about witnesses and documents. They make the argument, the President's counsel, that the President couldn't participate in the House process because they believe, I don't believe it's right, but because the President couldn't participate in the House process.
All right, we're monitoring everybody here and trying to be fair to everybody here. Lindsey Graham also speaking to the media right now. He will be a courting swing vote here. As I say, a swing because earlier on he had shared the concern of some of his colleagues who might entertain witnesses. Let's listen.
I'm ecstatic that it was only 2 hours. I think they did what a defense team would do, which is to go after some factual statements that won't stand scrutiny and tell you some things you didn't know that you think are relevant, or at least they hope you think are relevant. I think the body is ready to take a break, right, John? Yes, go home, exercise a little bit, come back Monday, and we're going to listen to what they have to say and about witnesses.
Are you going to see President Trump at all this weekend?
Not that I know of, but I'm looking for a free meal in case you're in town. Yeah, I got to eat somewhere. But here's the bottom line. I am more intent on ending this thing now with my vote. I know a lot of people on our side want to hear from Hunter Biden. I understand why. And litigate that whole issue. I just think it's best for the country to vote on the record established, because if you go down the witness road, you run into executive privilege in a way that no one's in uncharted territory. No one's ever been in the box we're in before, and I really don't want to turn the trial into a circus. There's a way to look at Hunter and Joe Biden outside of impeachment.
Will you be submitting any questions?
Or you've been listening to Senator Lindsey Graham. He is among those, one of the few Republicans really not interested in hearing from the Bidens, Joe Biden or Hunter Biden, saying that the case is what it is. Let's vote on what we have and move on. And not sympathetic or empathetic to the idea of witnesses, period. That there's enough evidence there to go ahead and exonerate the president. But again, you'll see this back and forth on the need for more information or respond to these latest developments and maybe look for more witness testimony. I think you're familiar with the drill. Just to remind you, assuming all 47 Democratic senators were for witnesses, they would need to peel off about 4 Republicans to get the 51 necessary to proceed to that. We're not there yet, and they might be laying the groundwork for that next week when Republicans resume. Let's get the read now from Michigan Democratic Senator Debbie Stabenow. Senator, thank you for taking the time. What did you think of the Republican argument today?
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure talking to you, and I would have to say at the outset that the question before us in terms of possible removal of the President of the United States, coupled with questions of going to war, are probably the most important decisions that we have to make. So I take this very seriously. I think over and over again, when we've heard differences about what was said, what was in people's minds, what were people testifying about, it just reaffirms for me that we really do need to hear from the relevant witnesses that know that the president's acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, the people at the Office of Management and Budget. I think we need to hear from them. And we're in a unique situation because we don't even have to go through subpoenas judges and courts at this point. We have the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court that is sitting right in the room, and he has the capacity to rule on whether or not a witness is relevant right away on the spot, whether or not there's executive privilege related to a witness. He can rule right away. So this doesn't have to take extra time, and I think to be fair and do this right, we need to hear from the relevant witnesses and get the documents.
All right, and I'm sure you've heard Republicans argue that the House managers had their chance to get these folks, and they failed. And you're quite right to point out, well, the president might have prevented them from speaking, but it is what it is. And I'm wondering, given the information you have now and the charges the Trump legal team was making, that Adam Schiff might have been very selective in the edited comments he chose to use in his many presentations, that he wasn't quite telling the truth to the American people. What do you say?
Well, this is how we're going to, as this proceeds, hear from the White House counsel. Then there'll be 16 hours of questioning back and forth where we can ask the House managers to respond, the White House to respond. And so, to me, we're listening to all of this to move forward. What I would say is that there are differences between what the White House managers talked about today in terms of other times of withholding aid, because Congress was involved and notified and supportive of those other times, working with a president to withhold aid. What is disturbing to me is that this is a case where the president did break the Impoundment Control Act. We all don't talk about that every day, but put in place after President Nixon because he withheld funds without the consent and knowledge of Congress. And so he did actually break the law. And so I'm going to be interested in hearing how the White House responds to the fact that in this particular case, contrary to all the other things they listed, Congress was not informed and not involved, which is the process that's supposed to take place legally.
But I'm no lawyer, Senator, but I'm told that other presidents, including this one, including his predecessor, have, when they, sort of rethought aid, either delayed it or adjusted it before they get back to Congress on that. What did you make of that?
Well, Neil, I'm not an attorney either, so you and I are in the same spot here. But what I will tell you is that this is the first time, to my knowledge, I have been in the United States Senate since 2001, where the Government Accounting Office has said that the president actually broke the law on this. And so, yes, there's going back and forth. That's fair.
That same accounting office, as you know, Senator, said the same about Barack Obama, and almost a similar incident here. I'm not here to justify whether their word is golden, but I am saying that there's enough precedent here where the GAO has raised these type of concerns with other presidents, right?
I think they're legitimate, regardless of who they raise them with. And I think that's part of what we have to address. But most important to me, I want to hear the specifics of, and the White House was talking about it today, but the facts that relate to the call, withholding the funds, how that happened. And certainly I will say this, I feel great sympathy for a new young Ukrainian reformer president who is now caught in the middle of this because he's trying to do reforms in his country. And it doesn't surprise me at all that they were quiet about what they knew about withholding funds for a long time, hoping it would never be public. They don't want to fight with the President of the United States or the Congress. They wanted to keep things quiet and try to work it out. And so I have great empathy for the position that this new young reformer is in.
All right, Senator Stabenow, thank you very much. Always good having you.
Thank you.
All right, in the meantime, we're going to take a very quick break here, keep you updated. This session has ended in the United States Senate here. Republicans had their chance to respond to 24 hours of Democratic House managers sort of laying out the case for impeachment in the United States. They had presumably up to 3 hours today. They took only 2. Whether that could be a sign of things to come when all of this resumes next week, anyone's guess. Maybe we'll get the read from Senator Mike Lee of Utah right after this.
Genuine issue of material fact. We don't have that here. We don't have enough factual disputes to necessitate the taking of additional live witness testimony. And so I believe we're going to go straight to a decision on the verdict, and I believe the president's going to be held not guilty.
All right. Well, as you've heard from many Democrats, or they've been saying it wasn't as if they didn't try to get more administration officials to testify. They were stopped, stymied, subpoenas were ignored. It was Operation Block from the White House. That's how one Democratic manager described it. So how do you feel it will go down if, in the end, Republicans, maybe for perfectly valid reasons, opt not to go the witness round?
Yeah, well, look, as we heard this morning, those characterizations by the Democratic House managers simply are inaccurate. What they've said over and over again is that the president and the White House just categorically refused to cooperate. That isn't true. They didn't go through the proper steps. They didn't have the proper authority to do what they needed to do. And I think Republicans and even some Democrats are starting to see through that. Just as they're seeing through Adam Schiff's mischaracterization.
I'm not here to play anyone's point of view here, but they did have 70 requests. They did issue 5 subpoenas. You're quite right. The administration has every right to respond the way it did, but that their argument is we tried, we were blocked. We think now that it's in the Senate, they should at least try themselves, you say?
Yeah. First of all, their try, their attempt in the House of Representatives was half-baked and without authority. Had they really wanted to get at this, they could have done it, and the White House would have fully cooperated had they gone through the proper steps. In any event, they've got more than enough evidence upon which we could and should and will make a decision in this case. And what this shows is that President Trump didn't do anything wrong here. He succeeded where Barack Obama tried and failed for years, to convince Ukraine to investigate the corrupt Ukrainian energy company called Burisma. That's not wrong. It's certainly not impeachable.
So were you surprised just the legal tact the president's lawyers took today not to even address the Bidens, Joe or Hunter, and then to make the argument today about, I think under the main headlines here, no need to go the witness route, no need to even mention the Bidens, no need to even get into that?
Oh, look, I'm sure they're going to be talking about the Bidens. There's no question about that. Today was a shorter presentation.
Right.
Today they got right to the point of what they believe are some of the fatal flaws in this case, and in particular, the fatal flaws in the argument that the House managers have been making over and over again, that this was obstruction of Congress somehow by the White House. That's nonsense, and they made that clear today through their presentation.
A lot has been made as well, Senator, about what Ambassador Sondland meant and what he was either inferring or outright stating when he suspected or in his gut felt that there was a quid pro quo, that the president was withholding or thinking of withholding aid to Ukraine because they might not be forthcoming, that is, the Ukrainians, and getting the information the president wanted on the Bidens. Now, they showed tapes, or the Republican lawyers showed tapes to say what was left out was that was his gut feeling, that was his opinion. He had nothing to base it on. But that was largely left out, even though he said it to this House committee. It was largely left out in the presentation that the Democratic House managers, relayed. What did you make of that?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. The statements were often clipped, particularly with regard to the testimony of Ambassador Sondland. They would show the House Democrats asking him a question, and then he'd say yes, or a comparably short answer. But they weren't very fair in acknowledging the fact that he said over and over again, yeah, this